Hello, time travelers. Imagine walking through the bustling streets of Istanbul in the year 1826. The air thick with the scent of roasting chestnuts, the distant clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestones, and the ever-present hum of gossip from tea-houses. But amidst this ordinary city life, a storm was brewing, one that would literally change the course of the Ottoman Empire. Did you know that in that very year, Sultan Mahmud II ordered his cannons to fire on his own elite army, a force that had ruled the empire for centuries? It's a shocking story of power, corruption, and ruthless reform that historians still debate to this day. The elite soldiers, known as the Janissaries, had long been the backbone of Ottoman military might, feared across Europe and Asia alike. They were the sultan's hammer and shield, trained from boyhood in a life of discipline, ritual, and absolute loyalty. Yet, by the 19th century, this once loyal corps had become something far more dangerous, politically powerful, resistant to change, and deeply corrupt. Sultan Mahmud II faced a choice that would define his reign: either reform the empire at any cost or risk its total collapse under the weight of tradition. If you love hidden history, hit subscribe and ring the bell to explore stories that textbooks don't tell. In today's video, we will uncover 6 brutal truths about the Auspicious Incident, the day when Mahmud II dismantled the Janissary Corps, reshaping Ottoman society forever. From their rise and dominance to the shocking massacre that ended their centuries-old power, we'll explore the human, political, and cultural consequences of this violent purge. You'll meet the soldiers, the sultan, and the ordinary citizens whose lives were forever altered. By the end, you might wonder whether any reform is truly possible without bloodshed. To understand the Auspicious Incident, we first need to travel back to the 14th century, when the Janissaries were founded. The Ottoman sultans were building a vast empire, stretching across Anatolia, the Balkans, and into Europe. They needed soldiers who were utterly loyal, disciplined, and detached from local power structures. Enter the Devshirme system. Christian boys were taken from their villages, converted to Islam, and trained to serve the Sultan for life. These boys were removed from their families, taught the arts of war, strategy, and etiquette, and instilled with a loyalty that bound them exclusively to the throne. The life of a young Janissary was grueling and total. From sunrise drills to strict military education, they were molded into a formidable fighting machine. Unlike mercenaries or provincial soldiers, they were professional, paid, and fully integrated into the Ottoman state apparatus. Over generations, the Janissaries became indispensable, feared not just for their battlefield prowess, but for their ability to influence politics. They often acted as kingmakers, supporting or deposing sultans, and their opinions carried immense weight within the palace walls. For centuries, they were more than soldiers. They were a state within a state. Religiously, the Janissaries were closely tied to the Bektashi Sufi order, which provided spiritual guidance and reinforced loyalty through rituals and communal identity. This connection gave them moral authority and social influence beyond mere military might. When a Janissary marched, he carried not just a musket or sword, but centuries of tradition, faith, and a rigid sense of honor. Civilians feared them, rulers respected them, and even foreign diplomats were cautious in describing or confronting them. The Janissary Corps had become an institution, blending religion, politics, and military discipline into a force that seemed untouchable. But the very qualities that made them formidable would eventually sow the seeds of their downfall. Their unity and loyalty were gradually replaced by privilege and entitlement. They began to interfere in commerce, enjoy tax exemptions, and demand bribes for influence. Over time, the Sultan's hammer became a bureaucratic elite resistant to any challenge. Yet, in 1826, they still believed that their centuries of service gave them the right to defy a reformist sultan. As we will see in the next, this arrogance set the stage for a violent confrontation that would shake Istanbul to its core. By the late 17th and 18th centuries, the Janissaries' discipline and devotion had begun to erode. What was once a corps forged in loyalty and hardship had become a hereditary institution, where sons of Janissaries and freeborn Muslims could join without the rigors of the Devshirme system. This shift fundamentally changed the character of the corps. No longer molded from young captives whose lives depended on obedience, the Janissaries became a privileged elite whose focus shifted from service to personal gain. They wielded power in the streets, in trade, and in court, often more concerned with influence than with military readiness. Privilege bred arrogance, tax exemptions, lucrative positions, and political influence made them virtually untouchable. Ordinary citizens and lower-ranking soldiers saw them as oppressors, but even sultans had to tread carefully. The Janissaries had become masters of palace intrigue, using threats, bribes, and intimidation to maintain their power. They resisted attempts at reform, mocking military innovations, European-style drills, and any effort to modernize the Ottoman army. Even when the state faced existential threats, the Janissaries often prioritized their own comfort and status over national survival. The irony was cruel. The empire's most celebrated defenders had become its most dangerous obstacle. Stories from the period illustrate just how far the Janissaries had fallen. Some engaged in street brawls, violently asserting dominance over merchants or civilians. Others collected unofficial taxes from local populations, effectively running parallel mini-governments. Imagine walking through a market in Istanbul and seeing a Janissary officer lean against a fountain, demanding a payment from a baker while casually sipping coffee, his muskets resting at his feet. These small, daily abuses, compounded over decades, created a tension that few sultans could ignore. Yet for Mahmud II, ignoring the problem was no longer an option. The corruption and stagnation of the Janissary corps also hampered military effectiveness. While European armies were modernizing with new formations, firearms, and artillery, the Janissaries clung to outdated tactics. Campaigns against rebellious provinces or foreign enemies were hampered by hesitation, insubordination, and bureaucratic obstruction. Their resistance to modernization made reform not a choice, but a necessity for survival. Sultan Mahmud II understood that the empire could not survive the 19th century with the corps frozen in the past. Every moment spent negotiating or appeasing the Janissaries only delayed the inevitable confrontation. Sultan Mahmud II ascended to the throne in 1808, inheriting not only a sprawling empire, but also a deeply entrenched problem. The Janissaries, unlike earlier rulers who sought to negotiate or appease them, Mahmud understood that subtlety alone would not be enough. For nearly 2 decades, he carefully orchestrated a plan to neutralize the corps without sparking a premature revolt. This was not impulsive leadership, it was chess at the scale of an empire. Every appointment, every decree, every military maneuver was part of a larger design. He began by cultivating loyal officers and forming a new army, the Asakiri, Manchuri, Mohammadi, trained along European lines with disciplined drills, modern artillery, and clear chains of command. These troops were designed to bypass Janissary resistance and demonstrate that the state could survive without its traditional military backbone. Mahmud also secured religious legitimacy for his reforms. He obtained fatwas and endorsements from key religious authorities, framing the creation of the new army not as a rebellion against tradition, but as a sacred duty to preserve the empire. Strategically, Mahmud isolated the Janissaries politically. He curtailed their privileges gradually, seized control of key garrisons, and kept intelligence on their movements. He used spies, informants, and loyal bureaucrats to report on dissent. Each maneuver was designed to erode their power without immediate bloodshed, but to prepare for a decisive confrontation. Imagine the Sultan in his palace late at night, candlelight flickering, maps spread before him, weighing options, while loyal generals whispered strategy. His every decision carried the weight of potential disaster. Meanwhile, Mahmud built public support for reform. He framed the Janissaries as a corrupt, self-serving institution, alienated from the people they were sworn to protect. This messaging, combined with the presence of the new army, created a tense standoff, a city on the brink, with both soldiers and civilians aware that history was about to be made. The stage was set for a violent clash that would determine the future of the empire. In the early months of 1826, tension in Istanbul reached a boiling point. Mahmud II had unveiled his new, loyal army, and the Janissaries recognized the threat immediately. Their centuries-long grip on power was at stake. The signal of revolt came in the traditional way: overturned soup cauldrons in barracks across the city. This ancient symbol of rebellion echoed through the streets, a stark warning to the Sultan that his enemies were mobilizing. Citizens peered from windows and doorways, sensing the coming storm. Horses neighed nervously as soldiers prepared, and whispers filled the markets, blending fear and curiosity. The Janissaries marched toward Topkapi Palace, confident that their presence alone could intimidate the Sultan into concessions. They remembered past occasions when sultans had caved to their demands, and they expected the same this time. But Mahmud II had anticipated their arrogance. As they approached, he displayed the holy banner of the Prophet Muhammad, a symbol of divine support for his actions. Loyal troops lined the streets, artillery positioned strategically, and barricades erected in key thoroughfares. The contrast between the confident, unruly Janissaries and the disciplined, modern army of Mahmud created a tension so thick it was almost palpable. Civilians watched as the city became a chessboard of power, unsure who would emerge victorious. Rumors spread. Some claimed the Sultan had lost his nerve. Others insisted he would crush the Janissaries completely. Street vendors abandoned their stalls. Families hid in homes, listening to the clatter of weapons and the distant thunder of cannon. The city itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that the events unfolding would echo through Ottoman history. Every alleyway, bridge, and courtyard became a stage for the ultimate confrontation between old power and new authority. By the afternoon, the inevitable clash began. Skirmishes erupted near barracks, with cannon fire cracking the skyline. The Janissaries, unprepared for modern artillery and disciplined infantry, faltered. Panic spread through their ranks as their once feared formations broke under sustained assault. The revolt, which had begun with confidence and hubris, descended into chaos. Streets that were moments earlier bustling with ordinary life now ran with smoke, fear, and the sounds of combat. The Sultan's plan, meticulous and deliberate, was unfolding with devastating precision. The bombardment of the Janissary barracks marked the most violent phase of the Auspicious Incident. Loyalist artillery pounded wooden structures, sending flames and smoke into the sky. Thousands of Janissaries perished, trapped by fire or struck by cannonballs. Those who attempted to surrender were often executed immediately. Estimates of the death toll range widely, but historians agree that at least several thousand died on the spot, with many more executed or imprisoned afterward. The scale of destruction was unprecedented for Istanbul's central districts, leaving a cityscape scarred and trembling. The streets ran thick with terror. Civilians, caught between loyal troops and the rebels, fled to alleys, mosques, and rooftops. Families hid children in basements, while fires consumed barracks and lodges. Imagine a father shielding his young son from flying embers, soldiers' cries ringing in the distance, and the acrid smell of smoke filling every corner. The massacre was not just a military operation. It was a human tragedy that touched every level of society. Even foreign observers, diplomats, and traders reported being horrified by the scale and ferocity of the violence. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Janissary leaders were publicly executed, often decapitated, while others were imprisoned or exiled to distant provinces. Their homes and property were confiscated by the state. Bektashi lodges connected to them were destroyed, dissolving centuries-old networks of spiritual and military influence. The cores that had shaped Ottoman policy, culture, and warfare for centuries was erased in a matter of hours. Mahmud II called it a renewal. Historians often describe it as the destruction of the empire's own backbone to survive. Despite the violence, Mahmud's plan achieved its objective. The Janissaries no longer posed a threat to modernization. His new army solidified its presence, central authority was reinforced, and a clear message was sent to any would-be rebels. Defiance would be met with uncompromising force. Yet the human cost remained, and the psychological impact on the Sultan, the citizens of Istanbul, and surviving soldiers was immense. The city, once alive with markets, prayers, and music, had endured a shock it would not soon forget. Following the massacre, Mahmud II moved decisively to dismantle the institutions that had supported the Janissaries for centuries. The Bektashi Sufi order, long intertwined with the cores, was banned, and its lodges, centers of spiritual and military guidance, were destroyed or converted. Their leaders were exiled or executed, erasing an ideological backbone that had sustained the Janissaries' influence. Simultaneously, Mahmud restructured the military along European lines, creating disciplined regiments, loyal only to him. These reforms were not mere bureaucratic tweaks. They represented a radical cultural and administrative reset. Istanbul itself bore the marks of this change, with barracks and lodges demolished, streets scarred, and the echoes of centuries-old power silenced. The Sultan's actions extended beyond military institutions. Guilds and political networks linked to Janissary families were dissolved, and privileges that had allowed corruption to thrive were revoked. Mahmud II sought to replace centuries of tradition with centralized authority, asserting that the empire could only survive by embracing modernization. Historians debate the morality of these measures, but from a strategic standpoint, the eradication of entrenched opposition allowed the Sultan to implement reforms previously blocked by his own military elite. This structural overhaul laid the groundwork for the modernization of the Ottoman state in the 19th century. Even after the purge, the shadow of the Janissaries lingered. Mahmud II remained deeply aware of potential insurrections. Former Janissaries fled to distant provinces, some fomenting rebellions, while others simply hid in fear. The Sultan's paranoia extended to spies and informants, who reported on even minor signs of dissent. Social unrest spread, particularly in the Balkans, where Muslim and Christian communities felt the impact of these power shifts. Civilians, long accustomed to the Janissaries' presence, struggled to reconcile the absence of their once feared enforcers with the new reality of centralized control. The psychological weight of the purge extended beyond Istanbul. Soldiers and citizens alike were haunted by the scale and ferocity of the massacre. Tales of fire, cannon, and execution traveled swiftly through the empire, cementing the event in public memory as both a warning and a tragedy. It was a moment that transformed not only military structures, but also the cultural imagination, a story of loyalty, betrayal, and the costs of reform written in blood. With the Janissaries removed, Mahmud II's reforms accelerated. The empire saw the introduction of modernized taxation, educational reforms, and centralized bureaucracies. His new army became a model for discipline and European-style tactics, providing the backbone for the empire's continued survival. The violent purge, though morally complex, cleared the path for modernization and helped the Ottoman state respond more effectively to internal and external challenges. The cultural shift was profound. Centuries-old military and spiritual traditions were replaced by states-centered institutions, fundamentally altering the Ottoman social and political landscape. Despite the strategic success, Mahmud II carried the psychological weight of his decisions. Thousands had died by his command, and even loyal officers feared potential backlash. Late at night, he reportedly pondered whether such extreme measures were truly necessary, or whether a less violent path could have preserved both reform and human life. The burden of leadership, the tension between moral responsibility and political necessity, and the haunting images of burning barracks and fallen soldiers were constant companions. History remembers him as a reformer, but also as a ruler who bore the heavy cost of modernization on his conscience. The Auspicious Incident teaches powerful lessons about power, loyalty, and the human cost of reform. 6 brutal truths emerge. Janissary power was rooted in devshirme and politics. Corruption and privilege eroded their discipline. Mahmud II's careful planning created a new army. The revolt demonstrated the limits of entrenched power. The massacre eradicated an institution, and the personal burden of leadership weighed heavily on the Sultan. Could the Ottoman Empire have modernized without bloodshed? Could reform ever be painless? These questions linger, inviting reflection and debate. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, and if you've enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten history, subscribe and ring the bell to join our journey. Thanks for traveling through time with me. Until next time, keep exploring the past.